November 11th, 1918. 11 o'clock in the morning. Abercorn, Northern Rhodesia. The war was over. In Europe, church bells were ringing. In London, Paris, and New York, millions poured into streets wet with November rain and tears of relief. 4 years of industrial slaughter had ended at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The guns had fallen silent along the Western Front. Soldiers emerged from trenches to embrace enemies who, moments before, they had been ordered to kill. But here, deep in the African bush, 1,500 kilometers south of the equator, no one had told Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck that the war was over. His army, if it could still be called that, materialized out of the morning mist like spectres. They wore rags held together with bark, fibre, and hope. Their rifles, meticulously maintained despite everything, gleamed in the pale sunlight. Many had no shoes. Some had no shirts. But they moved in formation, disciplined, unbroken, a fighting force that by all rational calculations should have ceased to exist 3 years earlier. The British officers who received them stood in crisp khaki, freshly pressed despite the humidity, staring at this impossible procession with a mixture of disbelief and something approaching awe. They had been chasing these men across half a continent. They had thrown armies at them, overwhelming numerical superiority, modern weaponry, unlimited supplies. They had hunted them through jungle and savanna, across rivers and mountains, through territories that spanned an area larger than Western Europe. And now, here they were, these Germans and their African askaris finally surrendering. Not because they had been defeated, not because they had been cornered or starved into submission, but because someone had finally managed to get a telegram through the wilderness to tell them that the war had ended 2 weeks earlier. General Lettow-Vorbeck dismounted his horse, a scavenged animal as lean and weathered as the man himself, and approached the British commander. His uniform, once the proud field grey of the Kaiser's Schutztruppe, had faded to something between dust and smoke. His face was gaunt, burned dark by 4 years under the equatorial sun, lined with malaria and dysentery and 1,000 nights sleeping on the ground. But his posture was erect. His eyes, clear and defiant, met those of his adversary without a hint of defeat. "Herr General," the British officer began, then stopped, momentarily at a loss for words. "What do you say to a man who has just waged the longest, most effective guerrilla campaign in modern military history? What do you say to a commander who, with no hope of reinforcement, no supply line, no possibility of victory, had tied down 300,000 Allied troops for 4 solid years? What do you say to a ghost who refuses to die?" In the years that followed, military historians would struggle to explain what had happened in East Africa during the Great War. It would be called many things: a sideshow, a distraction, a colonial skirmish of no real strategic importance. But to the men who fought there, on both sides, it was something else entirely. It was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, a preview of conflicts yet to come, and a story so improbable that even those who lived it could scarcely believe it had been real. This is the story of how one man and his phantom army waged a war they could not win, refused to lose, and in the process wrote a chapter of military history that would echo through the rest of the century and beyond. Act 1. The Illusion of Insignificance. August 4th, 1914. Dar es Salaam, German East Africa. Lieutenant Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck stepped off the steamer into the suffocating heat of the East African coast with the certain knowledge that he had been sent to the end of the world. Behind him lay Europe, civilization, the centers of power where careers were made and history was written. Before him stretched German East Africa, a colonial possession roughly the size of France and Spain combined. A territory that most Germans could not locate on a map and cared about even less. He was 44 years old, a veteran of campaigns in China and German Southwest Africa, a Prussian officer of the old school with a rigid bearing and a reputation for independence that had made him simultaneously respected and inconvenient to his superiors. This posting, he understood perfectly well, was a form of exile dressed up as promotion. The real war, everyone knew, would be in Europe. It would be over by Christmas, and Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck would miss it entirely. The colony he had been sent to defend possessed a grand total of 260 white officers and 2,640 African askaris. These askaris, recruited primarily from the Wahehe and Angoni peoples, were well-trained and disciplined, but they were equipped with outdated weapons and supported by virtually no artillery, no machine guns in meaningful numbers, and no hope whatsoever of reinforcement once the Royal Navy cut off access to the Indian Ocean. The British, by contrast, could draw on the vast manpower reserves of their African colonies, India, South Africa, and the home islands. They possessed naval supremacy, railway networks, established supply lines, and the calm certainty that comes from overwhelming material advantage. The conquest of German East Africa, British planners assumed, would be accomplished in a matter of weeks, perhaps months at the outside. It would be a mopping-up operation, a minor footnote to the great European struggle. The Germans in East Africa, wrote one British staff officer in August 1914, represent no military threat whatsoever. Their removal from the equation is simply a matter of applying adequate force in the proper locations. Adequate force would prove a slippery concept. Lettow-Vorbeck understood his situation with crystalline clarity. He could not win. The mathematics were brutally simple. He commanded a tiny force in a colony surrounded by hostile British territories, Kenya to the north, Rhodesia to the south, the Belgian Congo to the west, and the Indian Ocean, patrolled by the Royal Navy, to the east. He had no battleships, no heavy artillery, no aircraft, no realistic hope of supply or rescue. When war came, as it surely would, the logical course of action would be to arrange the most honourable surrender possible and spend the remainder of the conflict in a relatively comfortable prisoner-of-war camp. But Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck had not travelled 8,000 kilometres to surrender. In the sweltering evenings of August 1914, while war declarations echoed across Europe and armies mobilized by the millions, Lettow-Vorbeck sat in his headquarters in Dar es Salaam and made a decision that would alter the course of the East African campaign and, in ways subtle but profound, influence the nature of warfare for generations to come. He would not defend German East Africa. That would be impossible. He would not attempt to hold territory or protect the colony's economic assets. That would be suicide. Instead, he would do something far more dangerous from the British perspective. He would attack. He would keep attacking. He would force the British to commit ever larger forces to hunt him down. He would tie up troops and resources that were desperately needed in Europe. He would become, in effect, a permanent thorn driven deep into the flesh of the British Empire, impossible to extract without massive effort. He would lose eventually. That was certain. But he would lose slowly, deliberately, expensively. And in losing, he would win something more valuable than territory. He would win time. Time for Germany to prevail in Europe. Time for the Schutztruppe to become legendary. Time for his men to prove that victory is not always measured in ground held or enemies destroyed. "Gentlemen," he told his assembled officers on August 15, 1914, as news arrived that Britain had officially declared war on Germany, "we are going to make them pay for every step. We are going to ensure that for every soldier they send to Africa, one less soldier fights on the Western Front. We will be mosquitoes to an elephant. But even an elephant can be brought down by enough mosquitoes, especially if they bite in the right places." One of his captains, a young man named Ernst Müller who had grown up in the colony, raised a practical objection. "Sir, with respect, we have ammunition for perhaps 6 months of sustained operations. We have no way to manufacture more. Once our supplies are exhausted, we will be helpless." Lettow-Vorbeck smiled, a thin expression that did not reach his eyes. "Then we will take ammunition from the British. They have been kind enough to bring supplies halfway around the world. It would be rude not to relieve them of the burden." The room fell silent. Several officers exchanged glances. What their commander was proposing was not warfare as they understood it. It was something else, something that had no precedent in European military doctrine. They would live off the land and the enemy. They would strike and vanish. They would become predators in a wilderness that would devour any conventional army that tried to follow. It was madness. It was brilliant. It was, quite possibly, the only strategy that had any chance of success. November 2nd, 1914. Tanga, German East Africa. The British learned their first lesson in underestimation at a place called Tanga, a small port town on the northern coast of German East Africa. The invasion force was impressive by colonial standards. 8,000 Indian Army troops, veterans of imperial policing actions across Asia, backed by Royal Navy cruisers that could reduce the town to rubble with their guns. The operation was expected to be complete within 48 hours. Lettow-Vorbeck had roughly 1,000 troops in the vicinity. He was outnumbered 8-1. By conventional military logic, he should have withdrawn inland, preserving his force to fight another day. Instead, he rushed every available man toward Tanga and prepared to defend the indefensible. The battle that followed was a catastrophe for the British. The Indian troops, many of them new recruits who had never seen combat, advanced through the town and into a coconut plantation where Lettow-Vorbeck's askaris waited in carefully prepared positions. The Germans opened fire at close range. The Indian formations broke. Officers trying to rally their men were cut down. Confusion spread like fire through dry grass. Then the bees arrived. The gunfire had disturbed massive hives in the plantation. Thousands of African honeybees, aggressive and territorial, descended on both armies with equal fury. Soldiers dropped their weapons to tear at their uniforms, trying to escape the stinging clouds. Men ran screaming into the ocean. The battle dissolved into chaos. When the British finally retreated to their ships, they left behind more than 800 dead and wounded. They also left something more valuable: 16 machine guns, 600 rifles, and 600,000 rounds of ammunition. Lettow-Vorbeck's supply problem had just been solved by the enemy. In London, the disaster at Tanga was met with shocked silence. This was not how colonial wars were supposed to proceed. The natives, even well-trained German-led natives, were supposed to break and run at the first sight of disciplined European troops. The entire encounter violated the unspoken assumptions that underpinned British Imperial confidence. "We have been bloodied by mosquitoes," wrote one British officer in his private diary, "and the mosquitoes have developed a taste for blood." The Admiralty dispatched more ships. The War Office allocated more troops. What had been conceived as a minor operation requiring minimal resources was quietly redesignated as a campaign requiring serious attention. But serious attention, in 1914 and 15, was in desperately short supply. The Western Front was devouring men and material at rates that shocked even the most pessimistic pre-war planners. Every soldier sent to Africa was a soldier unavailable for France or Belgium. Lettow-Vorbeck had achieved his first objective. He had made his force too expensive to ignore and too difficult to eliminate quickly. He had bought time, and time, in war, has its own mathematics. Through 1915 and into 1916, the pattern established itself with brutal consistency. The British would gather forces for a major offensive. Lettow-Vorbeck would avoid decisive battle, strike supply lines, and melt back into the bush. The British would advance, occupying territory that meant nothing because the German force remained intact. Railways would be sabotaged, supply depots would be raided, patrols would disappear into the wilderness and never return. The Schutztruppe became ghosts. They moved through terrain that British maps marked as impassable. They carried everything they needed on their backs. When ammunition ran low, they ambushed British columns and restocked from captured supplies. When food ran short, they lived on what the land provided. The askaris, many of whom had grown up in the bush, taught their German officers to read the wilderness like text, to find water where there appeared to be none, to move silently through terrain that announced the approach of conventional forces hours in advance. Medical supplies became the scarcest resource. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical ulcers killed more men than bullets. Lettow-Vorbeck himself suffered through repeated bouts of malaria, commanding operations from a stretcher when he was too weak to stand. His medical officer, a tireless man named Ludwig Deppe, performed amputations without anesthetic, treated infected wounds with honey and maggots, and watched men die from diseases that would have been trivial to treat with proper supplies. "We are practicing medicine as it was practiced in the Middle Ages," Deppe wrote in 1916. "We save perhaps 1 man in 3 who develop serious infections. The others die slowly, in considerable pain, asking for mothers and wives they will never see again. I have stopped counting how many I have failed. Yet the force held together. Discipline remained tight. Morale, against all logic, stayed remarkably high. The askaris, who could have deserted into familiar territory at any time, remained loyal with a devotion that puzzled British intelligence officers. Part of it was leadership. Lettow-Vorbeck treated his African soldiers with a respect unusual for the colonial era. He paid them regularly, even when pay consisted of scrip that might never be redeemed. He ensured they received the same rations as white officers. He promoted based on merit. And he led from the front, sharing every hardship, every danger, every miserable night in the rain. But there was something else, something harder to quantify. The askaris were winning, against impossible odds, with no hope and no future. They were demonstrating to the world that African soldiers, properly led and equipped, could defeat European armies. Pride is a powerful motivation. So is the knowledge that history is watching. Act 2. The Mathematics of Pursuit. March 21st, 1916. Morogoro, German East Africa. General Jan Smuts surveyed the map spread across his field table and felt the first stirrings of doubt. The South African commander had been appointed to take charge of the East African campaign in February, bringing with him a formidable reputation earned in the Boer War and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He had assembled a force that dwarfed anything previously deployed in the theatre. 45,000 troops, properly equipped, supplied, and supported by modern artillery and even a handful of aircraft. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Multiple columns would advance simultaneously from different directions, converging on Lettow-Vorbeck's estimated positions, cutting off escape routes, forcing the German commander into the decisive battle he had been avoiding. It was the hammer and anvil strategy refined to perfection, applied with overwhelming force. It should have worked. On paper, it was flawless. But Lettow-Vorbeck was not on paper. He was somewhere out there in the wilderness, watching, calculating, moving through gaps that were not supposed to exist. Smuts advanced. He captured towns. He secured railway lines. He occupied vast swathes of territory. His dispatches to London spoke of imminent victory, of the German force reduced to scattered remnants, of a campaign in its final stages. The problem was that Lettow-Vorbeck kept attacking. Supply columns were ambushed. Rear guard units were shot to pieces in carefully planned ambushes. Patrols sent to establish the German position found only empty camps and cold fires. The Schutztruppe would appear as if from nowhere, inflict casualties, seize supplies, and vanish before reinforcements could arrive. Smuts found himself controlling huge amounts of territory while controlling nothing that mattered. His supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers of hostile terrain. His troops, drawn from Britain, South Africa, India, and various African colonies, suffered from diseases at catastrophic rates. For every man evacuated with wounds, 10 were evacuated with malaria, dysentery, or pneumonia. The mathematics were becoming obscene. Smuts commanded, at various points, over 120,000 troops. Lettow-Vorbeck never commanded more than 14,000, and often operated with fewer than 10,000. The ratio was 12-1, sometimes 15-1. Yet the German force remained intact, operational, dangerous. In London, officials began asking uncomfortable questions. How was it possible that an army larger than the entire pre-war British Expeditionary Force was being tied down by what amounted to a reinforced brigade of colonial troops? Where were these men supposed to be? The answer was obvious and devastating. They were supposed to be in France, in Mesopotamia, in Palestine, anywhere the war actually mattered. Instead, they were dying of disease in African jungles, chasing an enemy who refused to be caught. The pursuit of Lettow-Vorbeck, wrote one exhausted British staff officer in late 1916, has become like trying to grab smoke with your bare hands. Every time you think you have him cornered, you close your fist on empty air. The key to Lettow-Vorbeck's survival lay not in genius, though he possessed that in abundance, but in logistics transformed into philosophy. He had created an army that could exist on nearly nothing, that carried its entire operational capacity on the backs of its soldiers and porters, that required no fixed bases, no supply depots, no vulnerable infrastructure. The British, by contrast, were prisoners of their own sophistication. They needed railways to move supplies. They needed hospitals to treat the sick. They needed established camps, properly defended, connected by reliable communications. All of this took time, manpower, and resources. All of it created vulnerabilities. Every British advance required thousands of porters, often forcibly recruited from local populations, carrying food, ammunition, medicine, tents, and the 1,000 other items that modern armies considered essential. These porter columns stretched for kilometers, moving at a crawl, vulnerable to ambush at every river crossing and mountain pass. Lettow-Vorbeck used porters too, but his requirements were minimal. His men travelled light. They could march 30 kilometers in a day through terrain that would exhaust British troops. They knew how to find food and water. They knew which plants could treat infections, which animals could be hunted safely, which paths avoided British patrols. The campaign became a masterclass in what later generations would call asymmetric warfare. Lettow-Vorbeck was not trying to defeat the British army. He was trying to make the cost of defeating him exceed what the British were willing to pay. He was banking on exhaustion, frustration, and the simple fact that Britain had more important wars to fight. By the end of 1916, he had been forced out of German East Africa proper. Smuts declared victory and returned to South Africa, confident that the campaign was effectively over. The German colony had been occupied, the population secured. What remained was simply a mopping-up operation. But Lettow-Vorbeck had not surrendered. He had merely changed locations. He crossed into Portuguese East Africa, modern Mozambique, where he found fresh supplies, better forage, and a Portuguese colonial army too weak to offer serious resistance. He resupplied his entire force from captured Portuguese depots, then continued the campaign as if nothing had changed. The British were dumbfounded. This was unprecedented. Wars ended when you lost your territory. Wars ended when you ran out of supplies. Wars ended when rational commanders accepted inevitable defeat. Lettow-Vorbeck seemed to operate according to different rules entirely. July 9th, 1917. Somewhere in Portuguese East Africa, Captain Richard Hagen of British intelligence stared at the captured German diary and felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. Hagen was no stranger to irregular warfare. He had fought in India and on the Western Front. He understood the psychology of guerrilla campaigns. But this document, written by a junior German officer and recovered from a raided camp, revealed something that went beyond tactics or strategy. The diary entries were matter-of-fact, almost mundane, describing daily marches, skirmishes, medical issues, and supply concerns. But between the lines, Meinertzhagen detected something that British intelligence had failed to fully appreciate. This was not an army fighting in hope of relief or rescue. This was an army that had accepted its doom and chosen to make its doom legendary. One entry, dated March 1917, was particularly revealing. "We know we cannot win. We have known this since 1914, but we can refuse to lose. There is power in that refusal. Every day we remain in the field is a day our comrades in Europe have one less enemy to fight. Every British soldier sent to hunt us is a British soldier unavailable for the trenches. We are dying slowly, but we are dying with purpose. That is more than most men receive." Meinertzhagen included the diary in his intelligence report with a note that would prove prophetic. "We are not facing a conventional military force. We are facing an idea that has taken human form. Ideas cannot be killed with bullets. They can only be outlasted." But outlasting Lettow-Vorbeck was proving more expensive than anyone had imagined. The British Empire was pouring men and resources into East Africa at a rate that made the campaign one of the most costly sideshows in military history. By mid-1917, over 300,000 Imperial troops had served in the theatre. Casualties from disease alone exceeded 50,000. Actual combat casualties added another 15,000. And for what? To chase 300 white officers and perhaps 3,000 askaris across an area larger than Western Europe. The absurdity was not lost on British commanders. Neither was the brutal reality. They could not give up. To abandon the pursuit would be to admit that a tiny colonial force had successfully defied the British Empire for 3 solid years. The propaganda value to Germany, already enormous, would become incalculable. So the chase continued, grinding forward month after month, year after year, swallowing men and money while accomplishing nothing decisive. The askaris who formed the backbone of Lettow-Vorbeck's force endured hardships that would have broken conventional armies. They marched until their feet bled, then wrapped the wounds in leaves and continued marching. They fought battles with obsolete weapons against enemies with modern rifles and machine guns. They watched friends die from infected wounds that would have been trivial to treat with proper medical supplies. They went weeks on reduced rations, living on captured supplies and whatever could be hunted or foraged from the bush. And yet they remained. Desertion, which could have occurred at any moment and would have been entirely understandable, remained remarkably rare. British intelligence officers, accustomed to colonial troops who fought primarily for pay and would abandon the fight when circumstances turned difficult, could not comprehend this loyalty. The explanation, when they finally pieced it together, was both simple and profound. Lettow-Vorbeck had given his askaris something more valuable than money: dignity. He treated them as soldiers, not servants. He promoted men based on ability, not race. He ensured that they understood the strategic importance of what they were doing. They were not fighting for German colonial ambitions. They were fighting because they had proven they could stand as equals to any soldiers in the world. Alhaji Munyimku, an askari who served throughout the campaign and lived to age 93, would later recall, "The Bwana Mkubwa, the great master Lettow, he made us believe we were the best soldiers in Africa. Maybe in the world. We would have followed him anywhere. Many did follow him to death. But it was death with honor, and honor was something the British did not think we understood." This loyalty would be tested to its absolute limits in the campaign's final year. Act 3. The March to Nowhere. January 7th, 1918. Northern Rhodesia. By the beginning of 1918, the pursuit had taken on qualities of tragic absurdity. Lettow-Vorbeck's force had been reduced to approximately 200 Europeans and 1,500 askaris. They possessed perhaps 12 machine guns, adequate rifles, but dwindling ammunition. Medical supplies were non-existent. Officers performed surgery with knives sterilized over campfires. Bullets were extracted with whatever tools could be improvised. Men died from wounds that would have been survivable with proper treatment. And still they fought. They had crossed out of Portuguese East Africa and into northern Rhodesia, modern Zambia. They were now hundreds of kilometers from where the campaign had begun, operating in territory they had never seen, supplied by what they could capture from enemies who could not believe they were still in the field. British commanders had long since given up trying to predict Lettow-Vorbeck's movements. He went wherever the British were weakest. He attacked targets that seemed to have no strategic value, then revealed that those attacks had disrupted supply lines or diverted forces from more important sectors. He moved through terrain that maps said was impassable, appeared where intelligence said he could not be, and vanished when overwhelming force was brought to bear. The askaris were walking skeletons. Photographs from Portuguese prisoners, taken earlier in the campaign, show men who appeared healthy and well-fed. By early 1918, those same men had lost a third of their body weight. Their uniforms hung on frames of bone and sinew. Their eyes carried the 1,000-yard stare of soldiers who had seen too much and endured too long. But they could still fight. When attacked, they deployed with precision that would have been impressive in a fresh, well-supplied force. When they attacked, they did so with a violence and efficiency that spoke of 4 years of constant combat. The British learned to dread encounters with the Schutztruppe. These were not colonial troops who would break under pressure. These were soldiers in the truest sense, professional, skilled, and utterly committed. They should have surrendered a year ago, wrote one British officer after a particularly bloody skirmish. They should have surrendered 2 years ago. By all rights, they should never have lasted past 1915. Yet here they are, still marching, still fighting, still making us pay for every step. I do not know whether to admire them or curse them, perhaps both. By October 1918, the situation had transcended military logic entirely. The war in Europe was clearly ending. Germany was collapsing. The submarine campaign had failed. American troops were pouring into France. The Kaiser's armies were in full retreat. Anyone paying attention could see that Germany's defeat was a matter of weeks, perhaps days. Lettow-Vorbeck paid attention. He received occasional messages from Europe, fragmentary reports filtered through Portuguese newspapers captured in raids. He knew the situation was desperate. He knew that continuing the fight served no strategic purpose, but he had given his men a promise. They would not surrender as long as Germany fought, and until someone in authority told him that Germany had stopped fighting, he would keep his word. So the march continued. They moved northwest, seeking new territory to raid, new supplies to capture, new ways to make the British commit more resources to hunting them down. The askaris followed, loyal to the end, though they must have known by this point that the war was lost, that they were marching toward nothing but eventual surrender or death. On November 9, 1918, 2 days before the armistice in Europe, Lettow-Vorbeck's column captured Kasama, a small town in northern Rhodesia. It was a textbook operation. Careful reconnaissance, precise timing, overwhelming force at the point of contact. They seized supplies, released prisoners, and were preparing to march again when a British officer approached under a flag of truce. The war was over. Germany had signed an armistice. The Kaiser had abdicated. The message had taken nearly 2 weeks to reach Lettow-Vorbeck's position because no one knew exactly where he was. Lettow-Vorbeck received this news without visible emotion. He asked for time to verify the information with his own sources, such as they were. He consulted with his officers, and then, on November 13, 1918, he agreed to a ceasefire. The final tally was staggering. Lettow-Vorbeck had commanded, at various points, approximately 14,000 men. He had never received a single soldier, weapon, or bullet of reinforcement after August 1914. He had been outnumbered, by conservative estimates, at least 20-1. He had fought across an area encompassing over 1 million square kilometers. He surrendered with 155 Europeans, 3,000 African soldiers, and over 1,000 porters. He was technically undefeated. No one had cornered him. No one had destroyed his force. He was surrendering only because the war itself had ended. The British had deployed, over the course of the campaign, approximately 300,000 troops. Casualties from all causes exceeded 120,000. The financial cost was enormous. The strategic benefit was debatable at best. "We have defeated," wrote a British staff officer in his final report, "an army that refused to be defeated. We have conquered a general who was never conquered. We have won a war that feels remarkably like a loss." Epilogue: The Ghost's Legacy. September 12, 1964. Hamburg, West Germany. Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck sat in his modest apartment and watched through failing eyes as young journalists scribbled notes. He was 94 years old, one of the last living links to an empire that had vanished half a century earlier. The Germany he had fought for no longer existed. The Africa he had known was unrecognizable. The British Empire that had pursued him so relentlessly had dissolved into a commonwealth of independent nations, but the legend had persisted. Military academies around the world studied the East African campaign. Guerrilla leaders from China to Cuba to Vietnam cited Lettow-Vorbeck's tactics as inspiration. The man who had been exiled to Africa's end had become one of the most influential military thinkers of the 20th century, though he had never intended anything of the sort. "We were just trying to survive," he told the journalists, his voice still strong despite his age. "People make it sound like we had some grand strategy, some philosophical insight into the nature of warfare. We were hungry, diseased, exhausted men trying to stay alive one more day. If that became strategy, it was only because we had no other choice. But the choice to continue, the decision to keep fighting when surrender would have been entirely justified, that had been deliberate. And that choice had revealed something that European military doctrine had been reluctant to acknowledge, that will, properly applied, could overcome material disadvantage. That a small force, intelligently led and utterly committed, could neutralize a much larger force simply by refusing to be eliminated. In 1968, 4 years after that interview, Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck died at the age of 94. His funeral was attended by former soldiers from both sides, German officers and British officers who had once tried to kill each other and now stood together in respect for a man who had demonstrated that war was not always decided by numbers and firepower. But perhaps the most moving tribute came from East Africa itself. In Tanzania, the modern name for German East Africa, a group of aging askaris who had served under Lettow-Vorbeck gathered to hold their own memorial. They were in their 80s and 90s, the last survivors of that incredible campaign. They wore their medals, faded and tarnished but carefully preserved. They stood at attention as best as aged bodies would allow. "The Bwana Mkubwa showed us we were equal to any men," one of them said, speaking to a reporter. "Not just in fighting, in everything. When he surrendered, he insisted that his askaris be given the same treatment as white prisoners. He demanded we receive pay and pensions. He wrote letters to the German government, to the British government, to anyone who would listen. Most colonial officers forgot about their native troops the moment the war ended. Not Lettow. He never forgot. And he had not forgotten." In 1920s Germany, bankrupt and humiliated, Lettow-Vorbeck had lobbied tirelessly for his former askaris to receive recognition and compensation. He wrote letters, gave speeches, used what little influence he retained. Most of these efforts failed. The German government had no money and little interest in African soldiers who had fought for a colony that no longer existed, but the effort itself mattered. It demonstrated that the respect shown during the campaign had been genuine, not expedient. It proved that Lettow-Vorbeck had understood something that most colonial powers did not: that loyalty is reciprocal, that leadership is responsibility, and that the men who follow you into hell deserve more than abandonment when the war ends. The East African campaign of the First World War is often dismissed as a sideshow, a minor theatre that had no real impact on the war's outcome. This is technically accurate. Germany lost the war despite Lettow-Vorbeck's success. The Western Front, not the African bush, determined the fate of empires. But this misses the deeper significance. The East African campaign was a preview of wars to come. It demonstrated that conventional military power, however overwhelming, could be neutralized by unconventional tactics. It showed that willpower and commitment could compensate for material disadvantage. It proved that colonial troops, when properly led and respected, were equal to any soldiers in the world. These lessons would echo throughout the 20th century. In Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in every conflict where a materially superior force failed to overcome a determined enemy, analysts would reference Lettow-Vorbeck. The ghost army that marched through East Africa became a template, studied and adapted by both soldiers and insurgents. But perhaps the most important legacy was simpler and more human. For 4 years, men from different cultures and continents fought together with a unity that transcended race and empire. They suffered together, starved together, and faced death together. They proved that brotherhood could exist in the worst of circumstances, that respect could bridge seemingly unbridgeable divides, and that even in war there could be honor. On November 11, 1918, when Lettow-Vorbeck finally surrendered his undefeated army, he performed one final act that spoke volumes. He insisted that his askaris be allowed to keep their rifles and march out with full military honors. The British, after some hesitation, agreed. And so the last act of the campaign became a parade, with German officers and African soldiers marching together in formation, heads high, rifles gleaming in the African Sunday. They had lost the war. They had lost everything. But they had refused to be broken. They had demonstrated that even in defeat, there could be victory of a sort. The kind of victory that comes not from destroying enemies, but from maintaining identity and dignity in the face of impossible odds. In the years that followed, as empires fell and nations were born, as warfare transformed and the world changed beyond recognition, that image persisted, a column of ragged, unbroken soldiers marching out of the wilderness, ghosts becoming men again, carrying with them a story that would never be forgotten. This is the paradox of Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck's African campaign. He fought a war that meant nothing strategically and achieved nothing tactically, yet created something that endured longer than empires. He commanded an army that never won a decisive victory, yet never suffered a decisive defeat. He led men who had every reason to quit, yet refused until the very end. And in doing so, he wrote a chapter of military history that would be studied, debated, and referenced for more than a century. The numbers tell part of the story. 300,000 Allied troops deployed over 4 years, 120,000 casualties from all causes, millions of pounds sterling spent, vast quantities of equipment, ammunition, and supplies consumed, all to hunt down a force that, at its peak, numbered fewer than 15,000 men. But numbers alone cannot capture what happened in East Africa between 1914 and 1918. They cannot convey the exhaustion of men who marched 30 kilometers through jungle heat carrying everything they owned. They cannot express the skill required to survive for years without supply lines, reinforcements, or hope. They cannot measure the loyalty of askaris who remained with their German officers when desertion would have been easy and entirely justified. What happened in East Africa was a transformation. It transformed how military theorists thought about guerrilla warfare. It transformed how colonial powers viewed their African subjects. It transformed the reputation of every man who served in that impossible campaign. and it transformed Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck from a minor colonial officer into one of the most remarkable commanders of the 20th century. In 1953, the British journalist and historian Charles Miller interviewed dozens of veterans from both sides of the East African campaign. One conversation with a former British officer named Geoffrey Hodges captured something essential about the experience. "We hated him," Hodges said, speaking of Lettow-Vorbeck. "We hated him with a passion that I can scarcely describe. He cost us years of our lives. He sent our friends to die of fever and dysentery. He led us on a chase across half of Africa that accomplished absolutely nothing. And yet, when we finally met him at the surrender, when we saw what he and his men had endured, what they had accomplished with nothing but determination and skill, we could not help but feel something like awe." Hodges paused, collecting his thoughts. "You must understand, we were taught that we were superior, British officers, Indian Army soldiers, South African troops. We all believed that we represented the peak of military civilization. Then this German, with his ragtag collection of African askaris, made fools of us for 4 solid years. He made us question everything we thought we knew about warfare, about leadership, about what was possible." "Did it change how you viewed African soldiers?" Miller asked. "Completely," Hodges replied without hesitation. "Before East Africa, I thought of native troops as cannon fodder, useful for basic tasks but not real soldiers. Lettow-Vorbeck's askaris showed me I was wrong. They were as brave, as disciplined, as capable as any troops I ever served with. More so, in many cases, because they endured hardships that would have broken European soldiers." This revelation, repeated across thousands of British officers who served in the campaign, had consequences that rippled through the decades that followed. The British King's African Rifles, which had been a minor colonial force before the war, became one of the most respected military units in the empire. The French tirailleurs sénégalais received increased respect and responsibility. Across the colonial powers, the performance of African troops in East Africa forced a reassessment of capabilities and roles. It was a small crack in the edifice of colonial racism. Not enough to bring it down, not nearly enough to grant equality or independence, but enough to prove that the edifice was built on sand, on assumptions that could not survive contact with reality. The askaris themselves carried the memory of the campaign with fierce pride for the rest of their lives. They had marched farther, fought harder, and endured longer than any soldiers in the war. They had proven their worth on terms that could not be denied or dismissed. And they had done so under a commander who, whatever his faults and whatever the problematic nature of colonial rule, had treated them with genuine respect. This pride became part of the foundation for independence movements across East Africa. When Tanganyika, as German East Africa was renamed, finally achieved independence in 1961, veterans of the Schutztruppe were honored guests at the ceremonies. Julius Nyerere, the first president of independent Tanzania, specifically referenced the East African campaign in his speeches, noting that African soldiers had demonstrated their capability to the world decades before independence. "Our grandfathers who fought under Lettow-Vorbeck," Nyerere said in 1960, "too, showed that Africans could be the equals of any soldiers in the world. They marched across half the continent. They defeated armies many times their size. They never surrendered. This is our heritage. This is what we build upon." It was a complicated legacy. Lettow-Vorbeck had fought to preserve German colonial rule, a system built on exploitation and oppression. His askaris had fought for an empire that viewed them as subjects, not citizens. The campaign itself had caused enormous suffering among civilian populations, as armies from both sides requisitioned food, seized porters, and fought battles through villages and farms. Yet within that deeply flawed context, something genuine had been created. A brotherhood of soldiers who had proven that courage, skill, and loyalty were not properties of race or nation, but of human character. a demonstration that leadership based on respect could achieve what coercion and condescension could not, a story that transcended its time and place to become universal. October 19th, 2014. Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. On the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Tanga, the Tanzanian government held a commemoration ceremony. Veterans organizations from Germany, Britain, and Tanzania sent representatives. Historians gave speeches. Schoolchildren performed plays depicting scenes from the campaign. The event was carefully balanced, acknowledging the suffering caused by the war, while honoring the courage of those who fought it. There were no villains in the official narrative, no heroes in the simple sense, just men caught in circumstances not of their making, doing their best to survive with honor intact. One speaker, a Tanzanian historian named Dr. Abdallah Saleh, offered a perspective that captured the ambiguity and significance of the East African campaign. This was not a good war. No war is good. People died. Families were destroyed. Communities were disrupted. The colonial system that both sides fought to preserve or expand was fundamentally unjust. We must never forget these truths. But within this terrible context, he continued, something remarkable occurred. African soldiers proved they were equal to any fighters in the world. A European commander demonstrated that respect and dignity could cross racial lines. Men on both sides showed that even in the worst circumstances, honor and humanity could survive. These lessons matter. They mattered then. They matter now. The audience, a mix of young Tanzanians who knew the campaign only from history books and elderly Europeans whose grandfathers had fought in the bush, listened in thoughtful silence. The past was complicated. History was messy. But the story of Lettow-Vorbeck's ghost army remained powerful, remained relevant, remained true in ways that transcended simple narratives of victory and defeat. In military academies from West Point to Sandhurst to the People's Liberation Army National Defense University in Beijing, the East African campaign is studied as a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Officers analyze Lettow-Vorbeck's tactics, his logistics, his ability to maintain morale and discipline under impossible conditions. They study how he used terrain, how he conserved resources, how he turned every British advantage into a vulnerability. But the best officers understand that tactics and logistics were only part of the story. The deeper lesson, the one that separates competent commanders from great ones, was about the relationship between leaders and led. Lettow-Vorbeck succeeded because his men believed in him, not because of propaganda or coercion, but because he had earned their trust through consistent demonstration that he valued their lives and respected their dignity. This is a lesson that applies far beyond military contexts. It speaks to leadership in any circumstance where people must be motivated to accomplish difficult tasks with inadequate resources. It demonstrates that the bond between leader and follower, when built on genuine respect rather than hierarchy and fear, can overcome obstacles that appear insurmountable. The ghost army that marched through East Africa was not really an army at all, not in the conventional sense. It was a community of purpose, held together by shared hardship and mutual respect. It was a demonstration that human will, properly focused and sustained, could accomplish things that material calculations said were impossible. And it was a reminder, needed then and needed now, that the most important factors in any human endeavor are not the ones that can be easily measured or quantified, not the size of armies or the power of weapons, not the wealth of nations or the sophistication of technology, but rather the intangible qualities of courage, loyalty, resilience, and respect that make groups of individuals into something greater than the sum of their parts. Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck died on March 9, 1964, 56 years after the armistice that ended his war. He was buried with full military honors in Hamburg. His coffin was draped with the flag of a Germany that bore no resemblance to the empire he had served. The world he departed was unrecognizable from the one he had known in his prime. But his story lived on. It lived on in military history, in tactical manuals, in the memories of descendants of men who had marched across Africa. It lived on in Tanzania, where monuments to the Schutztruppe askaris stand as reminders of what African soldiers accomplished. It lived on in the understanding that wars are not always won by the side with the most resources, and that defeat on the battlefield does not necessarily mean failure in the larger sense. The Ghost Army had been real. It had marched, fought, suffered, and endured. It had achieved nothing strategically, yet everything symbolically. It had lost the war, yet won something more enduring than territory or treasure. It had proven that the human spirit, when tested to its limits, could still find reserves of strength and dignity. And in the end, that was the true victory. Not conquest or domination, not the destruction of enemies or the seizure of land, but the demonstration, carved into history with sweat and blood and unbreakable will, that people could transcend the limitations imposed on them by circumstance, race, and empire. That they could, through courage and commitment, become something more than the world expected them to be. This is why the story endures. This is why, more than a century later, people still speak of Lettow-Vorbeck and his askaris with a mixture of wonder and respect, not because they won, but because they refused to accept the terms of defeat that logic and material reality dictated. They wrote their own terms instead, and in doing so, they changed not just military history, but the deeper story of what humans can accomplish when they refuse to surrender to the impossible. The ghosts marched out of the wilderness on November 11th, 1918, became men again, and passed into legend. Their war was over. Their story was just beginning.